Hey, I'm J5 the Constant Grom, and what better way to learn how to grind than building your own grind box? This is the Boximus Prime, designed by Justin Thursday, and I made a few modifications. We're going to go through the entire build, what tools I used, what materials I bought, how much it cost, and I will show you all the mistakes I made, and I made plenty of mistakes, so you don't have to. This is J5 the Constant Grom. Join me while we build this box. Getting back into inline skating after 15 plus years, a global pandemic, and me breaking my arm last year, I'm trying to really now relearn all of these skills I had when I was younger. Key to that journey is building a super solid grind box so I can practice at any time that I want. If I just want to go out for a quick 10-minute session, this makes it possible. I'm basing this box off of Justin Thursday's original Boximus Prime design. As you see here is his original plans. What makes this build so amazing is the fact that he's using Trek decking, which gives weight and heft to the box so it's super stable, but also provides a slidable surface so you can do cess slides or even grind it as a ledge as opposed to just grinding on the coping. So I'm not as good a drafter as Justin, but I do know how to use Blender. So I decided to design my box with a little bit of the tweaks that I put into it in Blender. This allowed me to figure out all the fittings and the lengths of all the pieces of wood, while also figuring out what materials I needed to get from my local hardware store before I went there. But as you can see, I have precise dimensions here. I can select and go into edit mode, and you can actually see all of the different dimensions. One of the design tweaks I made as opposed to Justin's design is instead of the end caps being on the inside of the long 10-foot 2x6s, they're now capped on the outside. This gives a little bit more support as all of the stringers already have the lateral support covered. So this just gives a little more different dimensions of support, but either way works. This means I have to cut off 3 inches because one of the things you should know about wood, when you're saying 2x6, what you're really saying is 1.5 inches by 5.5 inches. And so the 1.5 inches times 2 end caps gives me the 3 inches I had to cut off of the longer run of the 2x6. The neat thing about this is the PVC piping comes in 10-foot runs, so it fits exactly. I don't have to do any cuts on the PVC, which is hard because it's round. Again, I want to iterate when working with dimensional lumber that 2x6 actually means 1.5 by 5.5, but the length stays the same as 10 feet. So let's flip the model over, talk about dimensions. The end caps are going to be 23 inches. The side wall ends up being 9 foot 9 inches. Those are both 2x6s. The stringers, which you see here that I'm highlighting, are 20 inches, and those are 2x4s. And the coping itself is 10 feet. We don't require cutting that. Now, I don't talk about the Trex decking because it comes in 12-foot runs, and we will use a trick later to trim them so you don't actually have to measure the 10 feet for the composite decking on top. So let's talk about raw materials. From the bottom up in groups, you're first going to need the 12-foot composite decking, 4 of these. Now, if you can find them in 10 foot, that's great. I could only find it in 12 foot. I would go for the cheapest one you can find that matches these dimensions. Don't necessarily have to go with Trex, which is a brand name. For your sidewalls, you can get 10-foot 2x6s in dimensional lumber. For your end caps, you will need an 8-foot by 2x6 dimensional lumber. You could actually get away with a lot less. There's a lot of waste there, but I could only find the smallest at 8 foot. And then for the studs, one 8-foot 2x4, which are very common. The PVC piping you want has to be the white Schedule 40. That's going to slide the best and have the best sort of resiliency to breakage. At 10 foot, you don't need to cut this again. The inside diameter is 1.5 inches. Remember that you are looking for the inside diameter, not the outside diameter here. For your miscellaneous hardware, optional is rigid casters. I got the 3-inch casters. This makes it easier to move around, but 5-inch may be better. I keep scraping the bottom of the box while I'm moving it if I hit a crack or an indentation in my driveway. So if I were to do this again, I would get the 5-inch. You are going to want 3.5-inch deck screws, number 10. With a star drive. I use star drive because they're harder to strip. This is for the framing. I usually get a 1-pound box. You're going to use a lot less, so if you want to go cheaper, you can, but you might have to run back and forth to the hardware store a lot more often. Then for the composite decking, absolutely you need the 2.5-inch number 9 composite decking screws. Do not use regular decking screws for this. They will not go in all the way, and you cannot get them out. The last screw you'll need is for the coping, and that's a 1 5/8-inch exterior screw with a Phillips head. You can get away with getting 6 of these. You don't really need the 1-pound box, but I use these often, so make sure they're exterior screws if you're going to leave this out. You could also use wood screws if it's always going to be put away, but they may rust over time. One more optional piece I did not put in here is handles. You may want to put handles in, but you can also cut handles into the wood. This is for lifting it and dragging it with the wheels. Without handles, it gets a little hard to dig your hands underneath, and it's so heavy you could end up actually injuring yourself. One of the things I forgot to mention is for the casters, you will need hex bolts. They are the 5/16-18 by 3-inch length. You will also need the nuts that correspond with those bolts in order to put the casters on to the box. Now for the tools that you should have. Speed square, again optional, but I can't recommend a speed square enough. Really cheap, and will get you super straight lines. Pencil, of course, for marking your cuts, and of course some sort of measuring tape. You can get away with just a driver. Again, you don't need the set, but it'll make your life easier and be faster. And the last thing you need is something to cut the wood with. You only need one of these. If I would recommend anything, it would be the circular saw. But a jigsaw will work. It's hard to get straighter cuts with that. But I'm actually going to be using something totally different. Here I am measuring one of the smaller pieces. Remember to measure twice and cut once. So I'm marking it off, and I'm going to use the speed square here to make a straight line across. Sometimes it's hard to figure out which way to orient it. Alright, that's done. Let's show a longer cut that I'm doing. So I go from the end with my measuring tape and measure out the 9 feet by 9 inches here, and do the same exact thing that I would do with a shorter piece, and mark it with a speed square. So here's the tool I'm using, which is my DeWalt miter saw. Now, this is a compound miter saw. You can just use a regular chop saw, since these are straight cuts, and they're fairly cheap. What these give you over a circular saw is just repeatability and easy to measure and check your measurements before you cut. So yeah, I just cut it, and then I locked it down, and now I'm making this cut. I will then take it and measure it against my other piece, and they are the exact same length. Now for longer pieces, you're going to want to support them somehow, either with another person. Here I'm just using a stepping stool and some blocks of wood. Now you're going to want to dry fit everything. Notice I use the speed square to make sure it's all square. Now I had some trouble with the camera. It's a new camera, so I missed filming screwing in the stringers, but it's basically the same thing. You want to make sure your bottom that you're at is flat so that it's at the top and not going beyond the top of the frame that you're making. I had a problem where my driveway is not quite flat, so I had to tip it over onto its side. So I'm using the 3-inch deck screws to do the framing. This is the regular deck screws, not the composite deck screws. And I will drill pilot holes here at the ends. And I'm just going to put 4 screws at each end. And basically at each point I'm putting basically 2 screws in. So for the stringers you would have 2 screws on the right side and 2 screws on the left side. And this is where having a drill and a driver works really well. You can just switch between the two of them. I had problems with batteries and stuff like that, so I ended up just switching with one drill at the end of the build. But if you set up correctly, you can go a lot faster. There you go. And just repeat that in the corners, and you are pretty much done. Now you want to lay out your decking. You can be pretty quick about this, but you're going to choose one side where the coping is going to go and the other side where the decking will be flush. So on that side, what you want to do is just tack that in using a pilot hole. So I actually am putting the holes a little further away from the edge for the first board, just so when I'm grinding, I don't accidentally hit those if one of them happens to just be sticking out a little bit over time. And so do this. By tacking in this first board, you will be able to then buttress all of the other boards against that first board, and so you don't have to do any real measurements or anything here. So they just go right up. Just push it as much as possible. You're going to have some bowing. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. So then you just go ahead and put 2 screws at each joist. So here's that trick I told you about earlier where we didn't have to measure out the decking, where I'm just using a circular saw to cut flush to the box itself. And I did make a mistake on the other side though, where I saw sawdust coming out and I had actually started cutting into the frame. So you got to be careful when you do this. So here we're putting on the coping. First we're going to just tack them in on either end just so that we can work more efficiently. Just the end of it. So we take those exterior screws and do that. And then what we are going to do here is we're going to put some tape in. This just helps with some of the tear out that you might get. It's not perfect, but you're going to want to put the holes on the inside. This is so that you don't feel them while you're grinding it. You can put them on the top. It's not that big of a deal. I have it on my other one. My other rail does that because it was easier. But with this, you have enough leverage that you can actually just put a hole on the side there with one of the bigger bits that you have. Make sure that the hole size is big enough for your other bit to get into so that you can screw down the screw. But I go in, just make sure you're only cutting one hole and not going through the entire pipe to the other end. Just clear it up, take the tape off. If you need to, so I cleaned it up a little bit by putting the drill in and out a bit, but if you need to, you can go over with a sandpaper to clean out the hole a bit. And then you just, as straight as possible, it's going to go in at an angle. You use your exterior screws and just screw them in until they hit the bottom of the coping. Fairly easy. Just repeat that at each of the joists. J5, the Constant Grom. Look out for my other videos on skating from the ground up, a series dedicated to the tech of skating. Till then, like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you later.